Welcome back. We are going to talk today about giving you a very general overview of clinical trials. This will be sort of the very foundation for a lot of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the semester. So please let me know if you have any questions about the content, if I've confused you in any way. So what exactly is clinical research? You know, we talk about the clinical research coordinator. So what is clinical research? Clinical research is simply everything that is related to clinical trials. Okay, that sounds too general and too easy to be true. Clinical trials then are the studies that are done in humans. This is an important part, and this is why I put it in red, to collect data to know whether a new drug is safe and efficacious. So clinical trials are studies undertaken in humans to collect data for the evaluation of safety and efficacy in new drug and device development. So that's what you really need to know. This is involving humans. We'll talk about non-human studies in a minute. And these clinical trials are always being done to establish two things. Is the drug safe? And efficacy means, does the drug work? So clinical research is everything that's done with humans to determine whether a drug or a medical device is safe and does it work. So who are the key players in clinical research? The very first one is an investigator. Investigators, and by virtue of delegation of responsibility, their staff, are responsible for finding and enrolling patients and obtaining data and for the study sponsor. These can be oftentimes dedicated clinical research clinics. They can be private practices. I see two physicians in private practice that both have clinical research trials that they undertake. So oftentimes the investigators will be physicians. Medical schools oftentimes will have investigators, and VA hospitals commonly as well. So the investigators find the patients to create the data. So the investigators are the group that brings data to the table. A sponsor is someone who initiates someone or a organization who initiates the research studies and then funds the whole process. Sponsors are key stakeholders in the development. National Institutes of Health is a good example of a sponsor. That's a federal sponsor. Biotech companies are either privately held or exchanged or publicly traded companies, which will sponsor studies. Pharmaceutical companies are very commonly study sponsors, and medical device companies. So the sponsors are then the consumers of the study data that comes from the investigator. An institutional review board is a very independent group. So the IRB, and I will call it the IRB for the rest of the semester, is someone who is very separate from the investigator and the sponsor, so independent group that oversees the clinical research in order to protect the rights and welfare of the people participating in the trial. So they will be separate because they're independent. They will be separate from the sponsor or the investigator. You will have academic IRBs. Northwest Vista College has an IRB. The University of Texas, all of the branches have IRBs. And they are all associated with research that's done in an academic setting. For investigators and sponsors who are conducting research outside of the academic world, for example, the private practices that I go to, they would use a private IRB. The private IRB would have no affiliation with an academic center, but they would still be independent. And the whole idea for the IRB is to make sure that the investigators and the sponsors aren't taking advantage of people as they participate in the trials. And so you could call the IRB the ethics police, if you will. The only thing the IRB is concerned about is, are you taking advantage of patients? So you can see how these three groups sort of work together but work sort of separately, and all for the same goal. And then you'll have a contract research organization. This is optional. You cannot do a study without an investigator, a sponsor, and IRB. Those three are absolutely critical If you don't have all three, you will not be able to conduct a study. Now, the contract research organization, the reason I bring them up here is because they're very common. The CRO is then a for-profit company that is then, they do outsourcing services. So, a sponsor will oftentimes hire a CRO. A sponsor, especially if it's a very small little startup company, will hire a CRO to do things that the sponsor just doesn't have the capacity to do. So safety monitoring, analyzing data, sometimes providing laboratory services, anything that the sponsor needs done that they can outsource, then that's where the CRO comes into play. Again, please be mindful, the CRO is not a requirement. It's almost a subset of a sponsor. Examples include Parexel, Quintiles, and Covance. And if my memory is correct, all three of them have offices in Austin, and including throughout the country. But the closest field offices for these you would find in Austin. So to summarize what these groups do and what they bring to the table, the investigator, oftentimes a physician, not exclusively, but oftentimes a physician, and their study site then contribute the data, because the investigator and his study site staff are going to find the patients, and from the patients data will be collected. The sponsor provides resources. So remember, this is the group that is providing money and the structure to conduct the trial. And oftentimes the sponsor will own the medication or the drug device that's being investigated. And then there's the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and they provide the ethical oversight. All three of these groups have to be together in order to have a study conducted. Again, I pause here to tell you if you have any questions about this or it doesn't make sense, I love to answer questions. Okay, moving on. Other roles, the CRA. We talked about the CRC. The CRA is a clinical research associate. You'll hear them called the study monitor. The study monitor actually comes and monitors or verifies the study data on a regular schedule. The CRA, the study monitor, will come to the investigator's site and look at the data that's being collected and created and verify that it is accurate. The CRA is a very important person. They work to coordinate things between the investigator and their study site, the study sponsor, and other partners, such as if there's a CRO involved. The CRA can work for the sponsor, the CRA can work for a CRO, and the CRA can be independent. Some of them work and they are their own employers. They are working on a consultancy basis. But you will always have a CRA on a study because they're going to come out and make sure that the data is correct. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester. The CRA has a lot, you will find when you meet CRAs, they are amazing, interesting group of people because they have educational backgrounds and therapeutic backgrounds that will run the gamut. I've met people with master's degrees in English literature that are able to work as CRAs. You'll find fewer of those. Those are less common. Most of them will have medical backgrounds. So where does it all begin? I mentioned who does what, but how does a drug get to your local pharmacy for you to use? It really begins in the lab. All drugs are primarily discovered in the lab. Compounds that are then developed for investigation are either created or they are altered compounds. And there are libraries that big pharmaceutical companies have that they use to identify potential agents. They will have extensive supplies of different chemical compounds, and they will try to identify which compound would be best for a specific medical use. And there are automated systems that will go through and try to find the drugs that will meet a specific endpoint. So this all happens typically at the sponsor's end. The sponsors, if those are pharmaceutical companies, will have these very large repository of different chemical compounds that they will try to figure out what compound will fix a medical problem. Now, preclinical research. I mentioned the clinical research is performed on humans. Preclinical research is performed on animals. And the primary objective of preclinical research is then to describe the drug. It's not done in humans. It's all done in animals. And before this starts to bother you, because some people do get a little concerned about preclinical research, regardless of how you feel about this, from an ethical perspective, it is required by federal law that preclinical research be done. So there's no real, currently, in our regulatory system, there is no way around this. It is a requirement in order to develop drugs for humans. So the primary objective is to describe the drug, but the secondary goal is to predict human risk. Every medication you take has a risk. And in terms of developing a new drug, if you can start to anticipate what the risk is going to be by looking at what happens in the animal studies, you can sort of, now, mice are not the same as humans, but you can sort of get a glimpse into what kind of problems might occur once you start giving it to humans. And we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. So I said here, if an adverse event happens in animals, then it's, and an adverse event is a term we use in clinical research to mean a side effect. Side effect is your sort of layman terms. We will call them adverse events for the rest of this forever. So if an adverse event happens in animals, it's probably going to happen in a human too. So we want to know what happens to the animal as well as the cells. We also want to know what happens when you dose a drug in an animal. What are the effects between the exposure? So how long does that drug stay in the animal's body? How often do you give that medication? Those kinds of things. And one thing that also has to be done in preclinical research is that once the medication is stopped, how long does it take before the drug has completely cleared the animal's body? And any adverse events that we're seeing, are they reversible? So once all of the preclinical research is done, all of that data that I mentioned before, and that was just really a synopsis, gets submitted in something that's called the IND. It stands for Investigational New Drug. And the IND application is where the sponsor sends all of that preclinical data to the FDA. The IND is the sponsor's way of saying to the FDA, we've done our due diligence with the animal studies and we are ready to start studying this chemical compound in humans. The FDA has 30 days in which to say yes or no. Now let me back up. It has 30 days in which to say no. If the FDA doesn't say no in 30 days, it is a default yes setting on day 31. The approval is required before any clinical trials can begin. The 30-day mark then means that it won't get held up in the FDA, sort of in a black hole of bureaucracy forever. So once that approval is then sort of defaulted into yes, clinical trials can begin, but not a day before. The IND, which is developed again by the sponsor, is the very basic blueprint for the development strategy of this drug. So the idea with the IND is, this is all of our preclinical work, this is what we want to do with this medication, and how we're going to develop it. So you have to have an IND every time you have a new drug that's going to be used in humans for the first time. A new indication for an existing drug. The FDA will approve a drug for an indication. So the example would be take Tylenol. You can take Tylenol for headaches. If the indication for Tylenol were to change and to be something completely different, you would have to have an IND for that. You'll see a lot of, if you start watching, when you watch TV and you look at commercials for prescription drugs, you'll notice that some drugs will have many indications. So you can take one drug for multiple medical conditions. Every time there's a new indication, then an IND has to be submitted. Change to the FDA-approved dose or route of administration. So if the dose is 10 milligrams a day, but the sponsor thinks that 20 milligrams a day might be better, then an IND is needed in order to explore that. If the route of administration changes, and commonly this happens where a medication is always more preferable in pill form than, let's say, an injection. Right? Wouldn't you much rather pop a pill than have a shot? So in that case, if the sponsor decides that they want to put that in an oral form, the route of administration has changed and an IND would be required. A new patient population. So commonly, the FDA will approve a medication for a specific disease, and if that sponsor wants to use that same drug for that same disease, but for patients who are, let's say, younger, or patients who have kidney failure, then an IND would be needed there. That's a new patient population. So let's talk about some key clinical trial acronyms. There are lots of acronyms. These are the ones I think that you will, especially once you get to your internship, get to use more commonly. I already mentioned something, IRB for Institutional Review Board. PK stands for pharmacokinetics. Now you can see why we have acronyms for this, right? Because it's so much easier to say PK. A PK is a sample of biological fluid, typically blood, but it can be anything. To see the kinetics means movement. So how does this drug move throughout the body? So when you take a medication, how long does it take before it reaches your bloodstream? How long does it stay in your bloodstream? Things like that. PD, you can probably already guess it's going to be pharmacodynamics. So how does the drug interact with different organ systems? MTD is maximum tolerated dose. And this is an endpoint for some studies. What is the maximum dose you can give to a person before they develop intolerable adverse events? And then ADME, absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So this is part of the pharmacokinetic. How is the drug absorbed into your body? How is it distributed? How is it metabolized? And then how is it excreted? So let's talk about the phases of a clinical trial. So in terms of developing a drug, we talked about the preclinical research, which is in animals. Once that's all done, then the IND is submitted to the FDA. If the FDA doesn't say no, the answer automatically defaults to yes, and we can start trialing and experimenting and doing clinical trials with this new chemical compound in humans. Phase 0. Phase 0 is pretty uncommon. I want to talk about it just because I want to expose you to as much as I can. So phase 0 is not very common and relatively new, and it's done to evaluate the pharmacodynamic and the pharmacokinetic effects in a very small population of patients before moving into phase 1. It's totally optional, and it's done oftenly with targeted agents. So we talk about medications that are designed to target a specific cellular activity. And so in this case, a phase 0 study is really smart because this is exploring what happens in terms of pharmacokinetics. So how is that drug distributed? Pharmacodynamics, how does that drug affect organ systems for medications that are very targeted? Because at phase 0, if it doesn't work out and it looks like it's going to be a lot of problems, it's easy to abandon the drug. 6 to 10 patients, very small study. The whole idea for the study sponsor is to make money, right? Because they want to be able to develop new medications that they can be sold to people. So phase 0 for some specific types of drugs is a really smart idea, because with 6 to 10 patients, it's not a huge amount of investment. And if it doesn't turn out well, the sponsor can go back to the drawing board and re-explore things in the preclinical area again, instead of wasting a lot of time and money. The idea here is to fail quickly so that you can save a lot of resources. So phase 0, again, it's not really common, and it's going to depend on the kind of drug that's being developed. And it's not required, totally optional. The FDA does not require a phase 0, excuse me. Phase 1 is required, and this is a study designed to determine the maximum tolerated dose, the PK, the PD, and safety/tolerability data. Phase 1 is just determining the dose. The preclinical research will help the sponsor to get a guess, a really educated guess on what the very first dose should be. But that is unlikely to be the dose that finally gets approved by the FDA. So if you take 200 milligrams of Advil for a headache, it's incredibly unlikely that when Advil was being studied that was the dose that they started with. This is sort of a matching and recommending a dose. 20 to 80 patients, almost always healthy volunteers. Some exceptions can be made for terminal diseases such as cancer, but these are usually healthy people. So looking at the maximum tolerated dose, the dose at which patients do not experience severe adverse events, and then gathering other data in terms of how safe it is. Phase 1B, it is a combo design. It is typically a standard phase 1 study design, plus the only thing we're trying to do in phase 1 is recommend a dose. And then the phase 1B study will look at initial efficacy. Does it work? So the phase 1B study is like sort of peeking in the oven to see how dinner's cooking. So it's an initial evaluation. It doesn't necessarily mean that this drug is going to get scrapped, because there aren't enough patients usually to say whether it works or not. 1B is also not required by the FDA, but we're looking at things from a business perspective, and just like the phase 0 study, the phase 1B could be a really smart idea if you want to decide to bail out and go back to the drawing board quickly. Phase 2. Phase 2 then is designed to look at whether it works, the efficacy, does this work? Safety and tolerability will continue to be monitored. And let me just say for the record that starting with phase 1, actually phase 0, any phase of study that you have, safety and whether this drug is tolerated will always be monitored, because the FDA is going to approve a medication on whether it is safe and whether it works. So the safety data is always going to be there with you. It never goes away. So phase 2 is, does it work? 20 to 300 patients. This is all going to be, how many patients are going to be needed, is going to be decided by statisticians at the sponsor, and it'll be written into the study protocol. But typically, as few as 20, as many as 300. Phase 3. These are the large trials now. They are randomized controlled trials to evaluate the new treatment against the gold standard treatment. So phase 1, we're looking at a dose. Phase 2, we're looking at it, does it work? Now, if it looks like it works, move on to phase 3 to say, does it work compared to whatever the gold standard treatment is? Because there's typically something out there on the market already that's being used. From a business perspective, what's the point of developing a drug if it's not as good as what's already out there? 300 to 3,000 patients. This is getting very large. These studies will be done across the country and will involve a lot of different sites. This will not be just you. So the new drug application comes in after the phase 3 study is done. If the phase 3 study says, yes, the new drug is as good as or better than the current standard standard treatment, then the new drug application is submitted. We will call it an NDA, and the NDA is the formal request to the FDA to approve a drug to be sold. The NDA is put together by the sponsor because they own the drug and they've been sponsoring this, they have the resources for it. And the NDA has a lot of stuff in it. The NDA is huge. Back in the day, before we submitted NDAs digitally, when everything was paper, it would be an entire 18-wheeler full of paper going to the FDA. Preclinical data, so everything that was done with animals, all of the clinical trial data from every site, from every patient, including all the safety data, all the PK data, all the pharmacodynamic data, everything. The drug formulation, the manufacturing processes. So now you can definitely see where this belongs to the sponsor. The FDA at this point is, excuse me, I had to go back, is going to say yes or no. They will say yes. When they say yes, they'll say either yes, a absolutely stamp of approval yes, or they will say a yes but. And that's where the phase 4 study comes into play. The phase 4 study is an ongoing pharmacovigilance evaluation of drug safety once it's been approved by the FDA for sale and distribution. So the FDA will say, hey, pharmaceutical company, we think that's a good drug. You've shown us that it's pretty safe and that it works, but we're not really convinced that you had enough patients on the study, for example. So we're worried that what will happen once you give that drug to a very large group of people in this country. So we want you to continue to have phases of trial. You can go ahead and you can sell it, you can distribute it. It's yes, but we want more data. So it's sort of a yes but answer. So the phase 4 study answers that. Not every drug has a phase 4 study. This is at the discretion of the FDA. So here are the references. We had a lot to talk about today. This again was the chapter and overview of research. I want you to send me an email, call me, Skype me, do whatever you got to do to let me know what questions you have, but make sure you read this chapter and keep in touch if you need something. And I will talk to you soon.